What if I told you that the most powerful city the ancient world had ever seen, a city with walls so thick that chariots raced along their tops, gates so magnificent they made grown men weep, and gardens so impossible they were called a wonder of the world? What if I told you that this city rose from a swamp rebellion led by a tribal chieftain nobody remembers, and collapsed in a single night because one king loved the wrong god? This is the story of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and if you think you know it, I promise you, you don't. Not like this, because this isn't just a story about kings and conquests. This is a story about how a civilization built heaven on earth and then watched it burn. Stay with me. Every satisfying detail is coming. And before we dive in, if you're the kind of person who finds this fascinating, and I know you are because you clicked, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, not later. Now, because what you're about to hear over the next 2 hours will change how you see the ancient world forever, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. The year is 626 BC. The Assyrian Empire, the most feared military machine the world has ever known, is cracking, not from the outside, from the inside. Their king, Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian ruler, the man who built the legendary library of Nineveh, is dead, or dying. The sources aren't entirely clear, and honestly, that ambiguity tells you everything you need to know about how fast things were falling apart. What we do know is this: the moment Ashurbanipal's iron grip loosened, every subjugated people from Egypt to Iran smelled blood in the water. And in the fetid, mosquito-choked marshlands of southern Babylonia, in a place most Assyrian nobles wouldn't have deigned to visit, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar made his move. Now let me paint this picture for you properly, because the marshlands matter. These weren't some romantic wetlands with gentle reeds swaying in the breeze. Southern Babylonia was a labyrinth of waterways, mud islands, and dense vegetation, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers dissolved into a vast, trackless delta before emptying into the Persian Gulf. The Chaldean tribes who lived here had been there for centuries, Semitic peoples who had migrated into the region around the 10th century BC and carved out an existence that was equal parts fishing, farming, and fighting. They were tough, they were resourceful, and they were absolutely sick of paying tribute to Assyria. Nabopolassar himself remains frustratingly obscure in the historical record. We don't know his father's name with certainty. We don't know exactly when he was born. What we do know is that he possessed two qualities that, in combination, are extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily dangerous: patience and ambition. He didn't launch some reckless charge against the nearest Assyrian garrison. That's what a fool would have done, and fools don't build empires. Instead, Nabopolassar did something far more cunning. He started talking. He talked to the other Chaldean tribes. He talked to the urban elites of Babylon, who had been chafing under Assyrian religious policies that subordinated their beloved god Marduk to the Assyrian deity Ashur. He talked to the priests, who controlled enormous wealth and wielded tremendous influence over public opinion. And what he said, in essence, was this: I am not a rebel. I am a restorer. I am not overthrowing the order of things. I am returning things to their proper order. Babylon was great once. Babylon will be great again, and I am the instrument of that restoration. This was genius-level political messaging, and I want you to appreciate just how sophisticated it was. Nabopolassar wasn't positioning himself as a revolutionary. Revolutionaries are scary. They threaten the existing power structure, and the existing power structure fights back. Instead, he positioned himself as a conservative, someone who wanted to go back to the good old days when Babylon was the center of the civilized world, when Marduk reigned supreme among the gods, when Babylonian kings ruled Mesopotamia as they were divinely ordained to do. This framing turned potential opponents into allies. The priests, they wanted their temples restored and their god elevated. The merchants, they wanted stability and profitable trade routes. The common people, they wanted lower taxes and fewer Assyrian soldiers kicking down their doors. Nabopolassar offered all of this, wrapped in the language of tradition and divine mandate. And it worked. City after city in southern Babylonia fell into his orbit, not through bloody siege, but through a combination of diplomatic persuasion and carefully targeted military pressure. Uruk opened its gates. Nippur followed. The populations of these ancient cities, weary of Assyrian taxation and military conscription, saw in Nabopolassar not a conqueror, but a liberator. And with each city that joined his cause, his legitimacy grew, his army swelled, and the Assyrian position in southern Mesopotamia became more untenable. But Nabopolassar was smart enough to know that taking southern Babylonia was one thing. Defeating the Assyrian Empire was something else entirely. The Assyrians had ruled the Near East for over 2 centuries. Their military was professional, experienced, and equipped with the most advanced weapons technology available. Their administrative system, however corrupt and overstretched, still functioned across vast territories. And their reputation for savage reprisal against rebels was well-earned and well-known. Nabopolassar needed help, and he found it in the most unlikely of places, or perhaps the most logical one. Enter Cyaxares, king of the Medes. The Medes were an Iranian people who had been building power in western Iran for decades, unifying various tribal groups under centralized authority, and developing a military force that specialized in exactly the kind of warfare the Assyrians feared most: fast, mobile cavalry operations that could strike deep into enemy territory and withdraw before heavy infantry could respond. Cyaxares had personal reasons for hating Assyria. The Assyrians had humiliated his predecessors and maintained a threatening presence on Median borders for generations. But personal hatred alone doesn't forge alliances. What brought Babylon and Media together was cold, clear strategic logic. Neither power could defeat Assyria alone. Babylon had the wealth, the cultural prestige, and control of southern Mesopotamia's agricultural heartland. Media had the cavalry, the mountain warriors, and the ability to threaten Assyria's eastern flank. Together, they could force the Assyrians to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously, the nightmare scenario for any military power, ancient or modern. The alliance was formalized around 614 BC, and it was sealed, according to tradition, by a marriage between the 2 royal houses. This wasn't just a military pact. It was a strategic partnership designed to reshape the political map of the entire Near East. The first test came quickly. In 614 BC, Median forces attacked and captured the ancient city of Ashur, the original capital of Assyria, the sacred heart of the Assyrian nation, the city from which the empire took its very name. Think about what that meant. Imagine if during World War II, an enemy force had captured Washington, D.C., not the current capital of military operations, but the symbolic birthplace of the nation. The psychological impact was devastating. Archaeological excavations at Ashur have revealed destruction layers from this period that testify to the thoroughness of the Median assault. Temples that had stood for over 1,000 years were torn apart. Palaces were looted. The accumulated treasures of centuries of Assyrian expansion were carried away as spoils of war. But Ashur was just the appetizer. The main course was Nineveh, Nineveh, the greatest city in the world, the capital of the mightiest empire the ancient Near East had ever known. Located on the east bank of the Tigris River, in what is now northern Iraq, Nineveh was a monument to Assyrian power on a scale that is difficult to comprehend even today. Its defensive walls stretched approximately 12 kilometers in circumference. Massive mud-brick fortifications punctuated by towers and gates that had been designed by the finest military engineers in the world. Inside those walls lived hundreds of thousands of people. The royal palaces contained thousands of rooms decorated with magnificent stone relief sculptures depicting royal hunts, military victories, and religious ceremonies. The famous library of Ashurbanipal held tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization spanning literature, science, medicine, mathematics, and administrative records. And in 612 BC, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares came to destroy it all. The siege of Nineveh was one of the most consequential military operations in ancient history, and the sources describe it in terms that suggest both meticulous planning and apocalyptic violence. Babylonian and Median forces converged on the city from multiple directions, establishing siege works that cut off all supply routes and prevented any possibility of relief. The attackers constructed earthen ramps, protective barriers, and siege engines designed to breach walls that had been considered impregnable. But the decisive factor, the detail that transforms this from a conventional siege narrative into something almost biblical in its drama, was water. The Tigris River, which flowed past Nineveh's walls, flooded. Whether this flooding was natural, artificially induced by the besiegers who diverted upstream water channels, or some combination of both, the effect was catastrophic. The rising waters undermined sections of Nineveh's mud-brick fortifications, creating breaches that no amount of desperate repair work could seal. Through these gaps poured the combined armies of Babylon and Media, and what followed was the kind of urban destruction that leaves archaeological signatures readable thousands of years later. Burned buildings, scattered human remains, abandoned household goods dropped by people fleeing for their lives, the chaos of a great city's final hours, preserved in ash and rubble. The Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ish-kun, died during the siege, possibly by his own hand, possibly in the fighting. The sources disagree. A remnant of Assyrian forces retreated westward under Ashur-uballit II, establishing a rump state at Haran with Egyptian support. But it was over. The Assyrian Empire, the terror of the ancient world for over 200 years, was finished, and the shockwaves of Nineveh's fall rippled across every kingdom, every city-state, every tribal territory from Egypt to Iran. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because destroying an empire is one thing. Building one from the wreckage is something else entirely. And this is where Nabopolassar showed that he was more than just a successful rebel. He was a genuine statesman. The division of Assyrian territories between Babylon and Media required delicate negotiation between allies who had very different interests and very different visions for the post-Assyrian world. Media took the northern and eastern portions, modern northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and the Iranian highlands. This made geographic sense, as these territories bordered Median homeland regions and included important trade routes connecting Iran with Anatolia. Babylon received the core Mesopotamian territories and the western regions extending toward the Mediterranean coast, the wealthy agricultural lands of northern Mesopotamia, and, crucially, the Levantine territories that had been the source of so much Assyrian wealth through trade and tribute. This territorial division was more than just drawing lines on a map. It was creating a new world order, And managing that transition required exactly the kind of pragmatic, flexible governance that Nabopolassar excelled at. Rather than purging every former Assyrian official, which would have been satisfying but catastrophically stupid, he selectively retained competent administrators who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime. He maintained existing administrative systems where they worked and reformed them where they didn't. He invested in infrastructure, restored temples, and presented his rule as a return to proper Mesopotamian governance after decades of foreign domination. The economic implications were staggering. Control over former Assyrian trade routes meant access to luxury goods, raw materials, and commercial networks that had previously enriched the Assyrian treasury. Babylonian merchants could now operate under state protection across territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Tribute from subject populations provided resources for military expansion and the monumental construction projects that would soon transform Babylon into the wonder of the ancient world. And then, in 605 BC, Nabopolassar died, and his son, a young military commander who had already proven himself in battle against Egyptian forces at Carchemish, ascended to the throne. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he was about to become the most famous king in Babylonian history. But that is a story that deserves its own chapter, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every word of it. Because what Nebuchadnezzar built, what he destroyed, and what he left behind changed the world in ways we're still feeling today. If you're still here, and I know you are, drop a comment below telling me what you find most fascinating about the fall of Assyria. Was it the flooding of the Tigris, the alliance between Babylon and Media, Nabopolassar's political genius? I want to know. And while you're at it, make sure that subscribe button is red. We're just getting started. Nebuchadnezzar II didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a problem wrapped in an opportunity wrapped in a crisis. His father was dead. He was hundreds of kilometers from Babylon, commanding armies in Syria against Egyptian forces who were trying to fill the power vacuum left by Assyria's collapse. And every ambitious noble, every scheming priest, every rival claimant back in Babylon was watching to see whether this young prince could hold together what his father had built, or whether the whole thing would unravel before the mortar on Nabopolassar's tomb was dry. He made it back to Babylon in record time. The sources describe a forced march that demonstrated both the urgency of the situation and the quality of the administrative systems Nabopolassar had established. Government functions continued smoothly during the royal absence. There were no coups, no succession disputes, no provincial rebellions. The machinery of state kept running, and when Nebuchadnezzar arrived in Babylon and formally took the throne, he did so with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to do and exactly how he was going to do it. What he wanted to do was everything, and what he was going to do was succeed at all of it. But first, he had to deal with Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II was not a stupid man. He had watched the Assyrian Empire collapse and immediately recognized both the danger and the opportunity. The danger was that a powerful new Mesopotamian empire would eventually turn its attention toward Egypt, as every powerful Mesopotamian empire eventually did. The opportunity was that the chaos of Assyria's fall had created a power vacuum in the Levant, that strategically crucial corridor of land connecting Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, that Egypt could potentially fill before Babylon consolidated its control. Necho had already established footholds in Gaza and other coastal cities. His diplomats were working overtime to forge alliances with Levantine kingdoms, offering Egyptian military support to anyone willing to resist Babylonian hegemony. This was a direct threat to everything Nabopolassar had fought for, and Nebuchadnezzar understood it with crystalline clarity. But here's what made Nebuchadnezzar different from so many ancient conquerors. He didn't just react, he prepared. Rather than immediately launching massive military campaigns that would stretch his resources and risk catastrophic defeat, he methodically consolidated Babylonian control over recently acquired territories. He established supply depots along major routes. He improved road networks that would allow rapid troop movements. He negotiated agreements with local rulers who could provide auxiliary forces and intelligence. He built the logistical infrastructure that would allow him to project military power across vast distances and sustain it for months or years if necessary. This is the kind of unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work that doesn't make for exciting stories but wins empires. Alexander the Great gets all the glory for his lightning campaigns, but Alexander inherited the finest army in the world from his father Philip. Nebuchadnezzar built his own war machine, piece by piece, supply depot by supply depot, road by road. And when he was ready, when every piece was in place, he struck. The siege of Ashkelon in 604 BC was a masterclass in the new Babylonian approach to imperial expansion. Ashkelon was a Philistine city on the Mediterranean coast, about 50 kilometers south of modern Tel Aviv. It had maintained close ties with Egypt and served as a crucial link in Egyptian supply chains, supporting anti-Babylonian activities throughout the region. It was, in other words, a problem that needed solving. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want to solve it, he wanted to send a message. The siege itself demonstrated Babylonian military capabilities that would have impressed any observer in the ancient world. Archaeological excavations at Ashkelon have uncovered evidence of systematic undermining operations, tunnels designed to collapse sections of the city's defensive walls. The attackers constructed elaborate earthwork fortifications that prevented relief efforts while protecting Babylonian forces from defensive fire. These weren't the crude siege tactics of a barbarian horde. These were precision engineering operations that required sophisticated logistical support, detailed planning, and the kind of organizational capability that most ancient armies simply didn't possess. But here's the crucial difference between Nebuchadnezzar and, say, the Assyrians who had preceded him. When Ashkelon fell, Nebuchadnezzar didn't simply raze it to the ground and move on. He didn't impale the survivors on stakes along the roadside as a warning to others, the kind of thing Assyrian kings had done routinely and even boasted about in their royal inscriptions. Instead, he established permanent administrative structures that integrated the conquered territory into the broader Babylonian economic system. Local rulers who submitted willingly retained their positions under Babylonian oversight. Those who resisted were removed and replaced with more compliant administrators. But the city itself, its economic functions, its commercial networks, its productive capacity, was preserved and redirected to serve Babylonian interests. This was empire building for the long term, not smash and grab, not terror for terror's sake, but systematic integration that turned conquered territories into productive assets rather than smoldering ruins. And it worked. The fall of Ashkelon sent a clear signal throughout the Levant. Resistance was futile, but cooperation was rewarded. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, the dominoes fell. Some through military pressure, others through diplomatic persuasion, most through some combination of both. The administrative approach that Nebuchadnezzar's officials developed for managing these conquered territories was remarkably sophisticated for its time, or any time really. The Levant was one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse regions in the ancient world. Phoenician city-states along the coast, Aramean kingdoms in the interior, Hebrew territories in the hill country, various tribal groups with their own customs, languages, and political structures. Governing this patchwork required flexibility, cultural sensitivity, and a willingness to adapt imperial policies to local conditions, qualities that the Assyrians had notably lacked and that had contributed significantly to the constant rebellions that had plagued their empire. Nebuchadnezzar's administrators developed what we might call a light-touch approach to provincial governance. They established clear expectations regarding tribute payments, military service obligations, and loyalty to Babylonian authority. But within those parameters, they allowed considerable local autonomy. Local legal traditions continued to function. Local religious practices were respected. Local elites retained their positions and privileges as long as they met their obligations to Babylon. This approach was cost-effective. It required far fewer Babylonian administrators and soldiers than direct rule would have demanded, and it was politically effective because it gave local populations incentives to cooperate rather than resist. The economic benefits of this territorial expansion were enormous. Control over Mediterranean coastal cities gave Babylon access to maritime trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Aegean world. Babylonian merchants established trading posts in major ports. Levantine craftsmen and agricultural products flowed eastward to supply growing urban populations in Babylonia proper. The empire was becoming not just a military power but an economic system, a vast network of production, trade, and consumption that generated wealth on a scale that Mesopotamia had never seen before. And then there was Judah. The kingdom of Judah presented Nebuchadnezzar with a problem that was fundamentally different from anything else he faced in the Levant, and the way he handled it would have consequences that echoed through millennia, consequences that are still shaping our world today in ways that the Babylonian king could never have imagined. Unlike other Levantine territories, Judah possessed something that made it uniquely resistant to foreign domination, a powerful religious ideology that emphasized the special relationship between the Hebrew people and their God, Yahweh. This wasn't just cultural pride or ethnic solidarity, though it was both of those things. It was a deeply held theological conviction that the land of Israel had been promised to the Hebrew people by divine covenant, that Jerusalem was God's chosen city, and that the Davidic dynasty ruled by divine right. These beliefs created a psychological resistance to foreign rule that went far beyond the normal resentments of conquered peoples. For the Hebrews, submission to Babylon wasn't just politically humiliating, it was theologically problematic. How could God's chosen people serve a foreign king who worshipped foreign gods? Initially, the relationship between Babylon and Judah followed the standard pattern of ancient Near Eastern vassal relationships. King Jehoiakim of Judah acknowledged Babylonian suzerainty, agreed to pay regular tribute, and received in return internal autonomy and protection from Egyptian interference. It was a pragmatic arrangement that satisfied immediate Babylonian strategic requirements, while allowing Hebrew political and religious institutions to continue functioning with minimal external interference. But pragmatism has a short shelf life when it's competing with ideology, and in Judah, the ideologues were winning. The Hebrew court was divided between two factions that saw the world in fundamentally different ways. The pragmatists, led by the prophet Jeremiah, among others, argued that resistance to Babylon was suicidal, and that God's will required submission to Nebuchadnezzar as a divine instrument of punishment for Hebrew sins. The nationalists, supported by other prophetic voices and by powerful elements within the royal court, argued that alliance with Egypt offered the best hope for independence, and that God would ultimately protect his chosen people against any foreign aggressor. Around 601 BC, the nationalists won the argument. Jehoiakim, apparently convinced by Egyptian promises of military support, stopped paying tribute to Babylon and began coordinating resistance activities with other disaffected vassals throughout the Levant. The timing could not have been worse. Nebuchadnezzar had by this point consolidated Babylonian control over surrounding territories and possessed the military resources necessary for sustained siege operations against any rebel who dared to challenge his authority. Nebuchadnezzar's response was characteristically methodical. He didn't immediately march on Jerusalem. That would have been the impulsive move, and Nebuchadnezzar was never impulsive. Instead, he first secured his lines of communication and eliminated potential sources of external support for the rebels. Phoenician cities that had maintained neutrality found themselves under pressure to declare their positions explicitly. Aramean territories received clear warnings about the consequences of supporting Hebrew resistance. By the time Babylonian forces actually appeared before Jerusalem's walls in 597 BC, the city was isolated, cut off from any possibility of Egyptian relief, surrounded by neighbors who had either submitted to Babylon or been neutralized. The siege was relatively brief. Jehoiakim died during it, whether from natural causes, assassination by pro-Babylonian elements within his own court, or some other cause. The sources don't agree. His son Jehoiakim, barely 18 years old and facing impossible military circumstances, chose surrender over destruction. And here is where Nebuchadnezzar demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of conquered societies that distinguished his approach from the crude brutality of earlier empires. He didn't destroy Jerusalem. He didn't massacre its population. He didn't even remove the Hebrew monarchy. What he did was far more surgical and far more effective. He deported approximately 10,000 members of the Hebrew elite. Think about that number and what it represents. 10,000 people out of a total population that probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands. This wasn't a mass deportation designed to empty the land. This was a targeted extraction of the people who made resistance possible. The military officers who could organize armies, the skilled craftsmen who could manufacture weapons, the religious leaders who could inspire popular uprisings, the wealthy merchants who could finance rebellion, the educated scribes who could coordinate communication between resistance cells. Babylonian administrators had conducted detailed surveys of Hebrew society and identified exactly which individuals needed to be removed to decapitate any future resistance movement, while preserving the agricultural workforce that made the territory economically valuable. The selection process revealed a deep understanding of how Hebrew society actually functioned, who held real power, who influenced public opinion, who possessed skills that were both dangerous in enemy hands and valuable in Babylonian service. Skilled metalworkers, carpenters, and stonemasons were particularly prized, not just because their removal weakened Judah's military potential, but because their skills could be redirected toward the massive construction projects that were transforming Babylon into the wonder of the ancient world. In place of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar installed Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's uncle, as a puppet ruler. This was another example of the pragmatic approach that characterized Babylonian imperial administration. Direct Babylonian governance of Judah would have required substantial administrative resources and risked provoking the kind of religious resistance that was uniquely dangerous in Hebrew society. A puppet king, on the other hand, maintained the fiction of Hebrew self-governance while ensuring Babylonian control through a ruler who owed his position entirely to Babylonian favor and who understood, presumably, what would happen if he stepped out of line. For about a decade this arrangement held. Zedekiah paid his tribute. The deportees settled into their new lives in Babylonia. Jerusalem remained intact. And Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to the project that would define his legacy more than any military campaign, the transformation of Babylon itself into the most magnificent city the world had ever seen. But Judah's story wasn't over, not by a long shot, and when it resumed, the consequences would be catastrophic for Jerusalem, for the Hebrew people, and ultimately, for the entire trajectory of Western religious history. We'll get to that, but first, we need to talk about what Nebuchadnezzar was building, because the construction projects he undertook during this period weren't just impressive, they were civilization-defining, and understanding them requires understanding the economic engine that made them possible, an engine of agriculture, trade, banking, and craft production that was in many ways as remarkable as the buildings it financed. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most underappreciated empires, the best way to support this channel is to like this video and share it with someone who loves history. It really does make a difference. Now, let's talk about how Babylon became the richest city on earth. The wealth of the Neo-Babylonian Empire didn't fall from the sky. It was pulled from the earth, literally. And the system that pulled it was one of the most sophisticated agricultural operations the ancient world had ever seen, built on engineering principles that wouldn't be surpassed in some regions until the modern era. Let me set the scene. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, had been the breadbasket of the ancient Near East for over 3,000 years, but it was a breadbasket with a catch. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically. The soil, while incredibly fertile when properly managed, was prone to salinization, the gradual accumulation of salt deposits that could turn productive farmland into barren wasteland within a few generations. Earlier Mesopotamian civilizations had struggled with this problem, and some had been destroyed by it. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Old Babylonians, all had experienced periods of agricultural collapse that contributed to political decline. The Neo-Babylonian engineers were determined not to repeat those mistakes, and the solutions they developed were nothing short of extraordinary. The centerpiece of their agricultural system was a network of canals that dwarfed anything previously attempted in Mesopotamia. The Naharawan Canal, extending over 400 kilometers from the Tigris River, was the largest single irrigation project ever undertaken in the ancient world up to that point. But it wasn't just big, it was smart. The canal incorporated adjustable weirs, essentially ancient dams with movable gates, that allowed engineers to control water flow according to seasonal variations. During flood season, when the rivers ran high and fast, the weirs could be partially closed to prevent destructive surges from overwhelming downstream agricultural areas. During dry season, they could be opened wide to maximize water delivery to thirsty crops. This wasn't just irrigation, this was water management, a systematic approach to controlling one of nature's most powerful and unpredictable forces. The canal system also included settling basins, large, shallow pools where water was held temporarily before being released into agricultural channels. These basins served a crucial function. They allowed sediment carried by river water to settle out before the water reached crop fields. This might sound like a minor technical detail, but it was actually critical. Sediment buildup in irrigation channels was one of the primary causes of system failure in earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. Channels would gradually fill with silt, reducing water flow and eventually becoming useless unless they were laboriously dredged, a process that required enormous amounts of manual labor and disrupted agricultural operations during the growing season. The settling basins solved this problem elegantly, trapping sediment in locations where it could be easily removed without disrupting the broader irrigation network. The The distribution channels that carried water from the main canals to individual fields incorporated their own sophisticated features. These smaller channels could be opened or closed according to specific crop requirements, allowing farmers to deliver precisely the amount of water each field needed at exactly the right time. This precision irrigation wasn't just about maximizing crop yields, though it certainly did that. It was also about preventing salinization. The key insight that Neo-Babylonian agricultural engineers had grasped was that over-irrigation was just as dangerous as under-irrigation. When too much water was applied to fields, it raised the water table, bringing dissolved salts to the surface where they accumulated in the topsoil and gradually poisoned the land. By controlling water delivery with unprecedented precision, Neo-Babylonian farmers could maintain optimal soil moisture levels while keeping the water table low enough to prevent salt accumulation. The results were spectacular. Cuneiform records from temple and palace archives document crop yields that frequently exceeded 30-fold returns on seed grain. To put that in perspective, medieval European farmers typically achieved yields of 3 to 5-fold returns. Neo-Babylonian agriculture was, by the standards of the pre-modern world, phenomenally productive, and this productivity wasn't achieved through some lucky combination of soil and climate. It was engineered through centuries of accumulated knowledge applied with systematic precision by administrators and farmers who understood their environment with remarkable sophistication. The construction and maintenance of these irrigation systems required a level of organizational capability that tells us as much about Neo-Babylonian civilization as any palace or temple. Royal archives contain thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting the planning, construction, and maintenance of irrigation infrastructure. These documents reveal systematic approaches to project management that would be recognizable to modern engineers. Detailed surveys of terrain and soil conditions before construction began, careful allocation of labor and materials, quality control procedures that ensured engineering standards were maintained across the entire network, and systematic maintenance schedules that assigned specific responsibilities to local communities, while providing royal support for major repair projects that exceeded local capabilities. Major canal projects typically required 10 to 15 years for completion and employed thousands of workers, including skilled engineers, experienced construction supervisors, and large numbers of laborers drawn from both free populations and deportee communities. The maintenance of completed systems demanded continuous attention, dredging operations to remove accumulated sediment, repair of canal walls damaged by erosion or flooding, management of aquatic vegetation that could obstruct water flow, and periodic reconstruction of weirs and other control structures that wore out under the constant pressure of flowing water. The crop diversity maintained in Neo-Babylonian agriculture was another source of both nutritional security and commercial wealth. The primary grain crops, barley, wheat, and emmer, formed the staple foods for urban and rural populations while generating surpluses for export. But the real money crops were the specialties. Date palms were the superstars of Neo-Babylonian agriculture. Cultivated in extensive orchards throughout southern Mesopotamia, date palms produced both fresh fruit and a dizzying array of processed products, date syrup, date wine, date-based confections, that commanded premium prices in international markets. The quality of Babylonian dates was legendary throughout the ancient world, and the expertise required to cultivate them was considerable. Date palms require specific soil conditions, precise irrigation schedules, and careful management of pollination, a process that Neo-Babylonian farmers had mastered through centuries of selective breeding and cultivation experimentation. Sesame was grown for oil production, sesame oil being the primary cooking and lighting oil in Mesopotamia, equivalent in importance to olive oil in the Mediterranean world. Flax was cultivated for textile manufacturing, producing linen fabrics that competed with Egyptian products in international luxury markets. Various spices and medicinal plants supplied both domestic consumption and export trade, with some commanding prices that made them more valuable by weight than precious metals. Livestock production formed another crucial component of the agricultural economy. Cattle herds grazed in the marshy regions of southern Mesopotamia, producing high-quality beef and dairy products. Sheep and goat flocks were managed through systematic grazing rotations that prevented overuse of pasture lands while maximizing wool and meat production. And these weren't just subsistence operations, they were commercial enterprises that employed sophisticated breeding programs designed to improve animal quality while maintaining the genetic diversity necessary for long-term herd health. The integration of all these agricultural activities into a commercial economy created opportunities that extended far beyond simple subsistence production. Many agricultural estates operated as what we would today call agribusinesses, commercial enterprises that employed wage laborers, utilized advanced farming techniques, and marketed their products through established trade networks connecting rural producers with urban markets throughout the empire. Some of these estates were owned by the crown, others belonged to temples. Still others were private enterprises owned by wealthy families who had accumulated land through purchase, inheritance, or royal grant. And all of this agricultural wealth flowed into a commercial system that was, by ancient standards, breathtakingly sophisticated. Babylon's strategic location at the convergence of major river systems and overland trade routes made it the natural hub of a trading network that connected the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea. Goods from India, precious stones, exotic spices, fine cotton textiles, traveled by sea to Persian Gulf ports, then up the Euphrates by boat or overland by caravan to Babylon. From Babylon they could be shipped westward through Syria to Phoenician ports on the Mediterranean coast, where they entered maritime trade networks that reached Cyprus, Anatolia, Greece, and beyond. In the other direction, Mediterranean products, olive oil, wine, purple dye, silver, flowed eastward through the same networks. Babylonian merchants served as intermediaries in this vast commercial system, and they were very, very good at it. They developed standardized procedures for organizing trade expeditions, procuring pack animals, hiring guards and guides, negotiating safe passage agreements with local rulers along the route, establishing partnerships with merchants in distant markets who could handle local sales and purchases. They created sophisticated accounting systems that tracked inventory, calculated profits and losses, and managed the complex financial relationships that long-distance trade required. But the most remarkable innovation in Neo-Babylonian commercial life was the development of banking. Yes, banking. In the 6th century BC, the banking houses that emerged during this period, the most famous being the Ajibi family enterprise, whose archives span over 200 years of commercial activity, provided financial services that would be recognizable to any modern banker. They offered currency exchange for merchants dealing in different monetary systems. They provided commercial credit, loans that enabled merchants to finance trade expeditions without having to put up the entire cost in advance. They managed investments, allowing wealthy individuals to participate in commercial ventures without direct involvement in day-to-day operations. They even provided something resembling international money transfers, using their networks of correspondent relationships with financial institutions in other cities to move funds across vast distances without the risk and expense of physically transporting precious metals. The Ajibi archives, Thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting loan agreements, partnership contracts, real estate transactions, and commercial ventures provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of how these banking operations functioned. Interest rates varied according to risk levels and loan duration, with typical rates ranging from 20 to 33% annually for commercial loans, high by modern standards, but reasonable given the risks involved in ancient long-distance trade, where a single shipwreck or bandit attack could wipe out an entire investment. Agricultural loans, secured by land or other tangible assets, carried somewhat lower rates. The accounting procedures these banking houses developed were remarkably sophisticated. They maintained standardized records of every transaction, calculated interest payments with mathematical precision, and tracked the performance of various investments in ways that provided reliable information for business decision-making. These records also served legal purposes. When disputes arose between business partners, the banking house's records could be presented in court as evidence, and Neo-Babylonian judges accepted them as authoritative documentation of financial agreements. The currency system that facilitated all this commercial activity combined traditional Mesopotamian weight-based standards with innovations that reduced transaction costs and increased confidence in commercial exchanges. Silver remained the primary medium of exchange for large transactions, but the standardization of weight measures and purity standards across Babylonian territories meant that merchants could conduct business with greater speed and confidence than ever before. You didn't have to weigh and assay every piece of silver in every transaction. If it bore the stamp of a recognized authority, you could trust its value. And then there were the craft industries, the manufacturing sector that transformed raw materials into finished goods and generated enormous wealth for the empire. Textile manufacturing was the biggest industry, employing thousands of workers across the entire production chain. Wool from Mesopotamian sheep flocks was sheared, cleaned, spun into thread, woven into fabric, and dyed using techniques that had been refined over centuries. The finest Babylonian textiles, elaborately patterned fabrics dyed with expensive pigments including the legendary Tyrian purple derived from Mediterranean murex shells, were luxury goods that commanded premium prices in markets throughout the ancient world. Metalworking produced everything from agricultural tools and military weapons to exquisite jewelry and ceremonial objects. Bronze remained important, but ironworking was becoming increasingly significant as improved smelting techniques made iron tools and weapons more readily available. The workshops that produced luxury metalwork employed craftsmen from various cultural backgrounds, including deportees from conquered territories, who contributed different technical traditions and artistic styles that enriched Neo-Babylonian material culture. Pottery production ranged from utilitarian household ceramics to specialized vessels for commercial and ceremonial use. Neo-Babylonian potters developed improved kiln designs that achieved higher firing temperatures with better temperature control, producing ceramics of exceptional strength and durability. And the glazed ceramic industry, the same technology that produced the spectacular decorations of the Ishtar Gate, employed hundreds of skilled workers who had mastered the complex processes required for producing consistently high-quality glazed products. All of this, the agriculture, the trade, the banking, the manufacturing, created an economic engine of extraordinary power. And Nebuchadnezzar was about to channel that power into the most ambitious construction program the ancient world had ever seen. Let me tell you about the walls of Babylon, because before we talk about the gardens and the gates and the palaces, we need to talk about the walls. Because the walls tell you everything you need to know about what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do and how seriously he took the task. The fortification system that Nebuchadnezzar built around Babylon was, without exaggeration, the most ambitious defensive construction project ever attempted in the ancient world. It wasn't just a wall, it was a system, multiple lines of defense, each designed to address specific military threats, all integrated into a comprehensive defensive architecture that was intended to make Babylon literally unconquerable. The numbers alone are staggering. The new fortifications extended approximately 18 kilometers in circumference, encompassing not just the old city center, but the growing suburban areas that had expanded beyond the earlier defensive perimeter. The outer wall, called Enlil, reached heights of approximately 25 meters. That's roughly the height of an 8-story building. And it wasn't just tall, it was wide. Wide enough that chariots could drive along the top. Wide enough that defenders could move troops and equipment along the wall's summit without being exposed to enemy fire from below. But the outer wall was just the beginning. Inside it stood the inner wall, Enlil, approximately 21 meters high and constructed entirely of fired brick for maximum durability. Between the two walls was a space of about 23 meters, filled with rubble and earth to create a massive defensive barrier that could absorb the impact of siege engines while providing elevated positions for defensive artillery. This double-wall system was revolutionary. No attacking force in the ancient world possessed siege equipment capable of breaching both walls in sequence while under fire from defenders positioned on the inner wall's elevated ramparts. The foundations of these walls extended up to 10 meters below ground level, deep enough to prevent the kind of undermining operations that Babylonian forces had themselves employed against enemy cities. These foundations were constructed from carefully fitted stone blocks, not mud brick, providing stable bases that could support the enormous weight of the superstructures above while resisting water damage from seasonal flooding and underground seepage. The foundations also incorporated drainage systems, channels and pipes that directed groundwater away from the wall bases, preventing the kind of structural weakening that had contributed to Nineveh's fall. Projecting towers were spaced at regular intervals along both walls, providing overlapping fields of fire that eliminated dead zones where attackers might shelter from defensive missiles. The gates, and there were several serving different districts and traffic flows, incorporated multiple defensive chambers connected by passages that forced attacking forces to navigate a series of killing zones under constant fire from elevated positions. Each gate was essentially a fortress within the fortress, designed to be defended independently even if the surrounding wall sections were compromised. And then there was the moat, a water-filled channel running along the exterior of the outer wall, fed by the Euphrates River through carefully engineered channels that maintained consistent water levels regardless of seasonal variations in river flow. The moat served multiple defensive functions. It prevented attackers from approaching the wall base with siege engines. It complicated undermining operations by flooding any tunnels that breached the moat's bed, and it created an additional psychological barrier that reinforced the impression of Babylon's impregnability. The construction of this entire system required resources on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Millions upon millions of bricks, both mud brick for the bulk of the walls and fired brick for critical structural elements and exterior facings. Thousands of workers laboring for years, decades, to complete the project. Specialized engineers who understood the principles of defensive architecture, hydraulic engineering, and large-scale construction management, and the administrative apparatus to coordinate all of it, to ensure that materials arrived where they were needed, that workers were fed and housed, that quality standards were maintained across a construction site that stretched for 18 kilometers. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't building walls just to keep enemies out. He was building a statement, and the ultimate expression of that statement was the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate. Even the name sounds like something from a fantasy novel. And the reality was, if anything, more fantastic than fiction. The gate was dedicated to Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love and war. a deity whose dual nature perfectly reflected the Neo-Babylonian Empire's self-image as both a civilization of extraordinary cultural refinement and a military power of terrifying capability. The structure itself measured approximately 47 meters in height, taller than a 15-story building, and incorporated multiple defensive chambers that made it a formidable military installation in its own right. But it was the decoration that made the Ishtar Gate one of the wonders of the ancient world. The entire surface of the gate was covered in glazed bricks, thousands upon thousands of them, creating a facade of brilliant lapis lazuli blue that would have been visible from kilometers away across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Against this blue background, relief sculptures of two types of creatures marched in stately procession: dragons sacred to the god Marduk, and bulls sacred to the weather god Adad. These weren't crude stylized figures. They were detailed, naturalistic sculptures rendered in gold and white glazes that stood out dramatically against the blue background, creating an effect that contemporary visitors described in terms of awe and wonder. The manufacturing process required for these glazed bricks represented a significant technological achievement. Each brick was individually molded with a portion of a relief figure, then glazed with pigments that had to be precisely formulated to achieve the desired colors. The brilliant blue background required lapis lazuli-based pigments imported from mines in Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers away. The gold and white glazes used for the relief figures required different chemical compositions and different firing temperatures, and every single brick had to be manufactured to precise dimensional tolerances, because when they were assembled in the wall, the portions of relief figures on adjacent bricks had to align perfectly to create coherent images. A single brick that was too large, too small, or improperly glazed would disrupt the entire decorative program. The logistics of this manufacturing process were staggering. Thousands of bricks had to be produced, each one individually crafted and quality checked before installation. The kilns required precise temperature control. Too hot, and the glazes would bubble and discolor. Too cool, and they wouldn't fuse properly with the brick surface. The installation process required skilled masons who could place each brick in exactly the right position, with exactly the right amount of mortar, to ensure both structural integrity and decorative alignment. The entire project took approximately 15 years of continuous work by teams of specialized craftsmen, and the Ishtar Gate was just the beginning of the processional way. Extending from the gate toward Babylon's ceremonial center, the processional way was a magnificent avenue, approximately 1.2 kilometers long and 20 meters wide, paved with specially manufactured bricks designed to withstand heavy traffic from ceremonial processions and military parades. The street's borders were lined with walls decorated with additional glazed brick reliefs, this time depicting lions sacred to the goddess Ishtar, striding in majestic procession along the avenue's length. There were approximately 120 lion reliefs in total, each one a masterpiece of ancient ceramic art, each one contributing to the overwhelming visual impact of an avenue that was designed to make every visitor feel as though they were walking through a corridor of divine power. The engineering challenges of the processional way went far beyond decoration. The roadway required extensive excavation and grading to create a perfectly level surface with proper drainage. Underground channels collected rainwater and directed it toward the Euphrates through carefully designed outlets that prevented erosion damage to nearby structures. The road surface incorporated slight crowning, a gentle curve from center to edges that encouraged water runoff while maintaining comfortable conditions for pedestrian and vehicular traffic. These are the same engineering principles used in modern road construction, applied with remarkable precision over 2,500 years ago. The psychological impact of this architectural ensemble cannot be overstated. Imagine you are a foreign diplomat or tribute bearer, Arriving in Babylon for the first time, you approach the city across the flat Mesopotamian plain, and from kilometers away you can see the walls, massive, towering, seemingly endless. As you draw closer, the Ishtar Gate comes into view, a mountain of brilliant blue rising above the walls, decorated with supernatural creatures that seem to move in the shifting light. You pass through the gate, navigating defensive chambers that remind you, subtly but unmistakably, of the military power that built this place. And then you emerge onto the processional way, flanked by walls of glazed lions, walking toward the heart of the most powerful empire in the world. By the time you reach the throne room, you were already conquered, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. The architecture had done its work before a single word was spoken. Now let's talk about the building that everyone wants to hear about, the one that made Babylon famous across the ancient world and that still captures our imagination today. Let's talk about the Hanging Gardens. I need to be honest with you here, because intellectual honesty matters more than a good story. The historical existence of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon remains one of the most debated questions in ancient history. No contemporary Babylonian source mentions them. The earliest descriptions come from Greek and Roman authors, writing centuries after the Neo-Babylonian period, and their accounts contain inconsistencies and legendary elements that make historians cautious about accepting them at face value. Some scholars have suggested that the gardens may have been located at Nineveh rather than Babylon, or that they may be entirely legendary, a romantic invention that became attached to Babylon's reputation as the world's most magnificent city. But here's what we do know. The Neo-Babylonian engineers possessed the technical capability to build something like the Hanging Gardens, and the archaeological evidence suggests that they may well have done so. Excavations in the palace complex area of ancient Babylon have uncovered elaborate hydraulic systems, water channels, storage systems, and mechanical installations that demonstrate engineering capabilities fully consistent with the kind of elevated irrigation described in classical accounts. These systems incorporated bronze and lead piping, mechanical pumping devices, and carefully designed distribution networks that could have supplied water to elevated garden installations while maintaining adequate pressure for effective irrigation. The classical descriptions, for what they're worth, describe terraced gardens rising to heights that provided views across the Mesopotamian plain, supported by massive stone columns and arched vaults that created the structural framework for elevated planting beds. Water was lifted from the Euphrates River through mechanical devices, probably chain pumps or Archimedean screws operated by human labor, and distributed through channels that irrigated each terrace level before cascading down to the next. The horticultural challenge would have been enormous. The gardens reportedly contained trees and plants from various regions of the empire, cedars from Lebanon, exotic flowers from Iran, fruit trees from the Mediterranean coast. Maintaining such a diverse botanical collection in the harsh Mesopotamian climate would have required specialized knowledge of soil preparation, irrigation scheduling, pest management, and microclimate control that represented significant advances in ancient agricultural science. Whether or not the Hanging Gardens existed exactly as described in classical sources, they represent something important about Neo-Babylonian civilization: the ambition to transcend natural limitations through engineering ingenuity. In a flat, arid landscape where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, someone conceived the idea of building a mountain of greenery, a living monument to human creativity and technical skill that would stand as proof that Babylon could achieve anything it set its mind to. And that ambition extended to every aspect of the city's construction. The palace complexes built during Nebuchadnezzar's reign were the largest and most luxurious residential structures in the ancient world. The southern palace alone covered approximately 5.2 hectares, roughly the size of 10 football fields, and incorporated multiple courtyards, throne rooms, residential apartments, and administrative facilities. The throne room measured approximately 52 meters in length and 17 meters in width, with ceilings reaching heights of over 20 meters, supported by massive columns decorated with glazed brick capitals. The walls were covered with glazed brick reliefs depicting royal hunting scenes, divine symbols, and tribute processions. Visual narratives of imperial achievement that surrounded visitors with images of Babylonian power and divine favor. The residential portions of the palace incorporated environmental control systems that were remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world. Thick walls with air circulation chambers moderated temperature extremes. Elevated floors promoted air movement. Strategically placed windows maximized natural lighting, while minimizing heat gain during the brutal Mesopotamian summers. Elaborate bathing facilities with heated water systems and decorative pools provided luxury that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The northern palace, constructed later in Nebuchadnezzar's reign, covered approximately 4.1 hectares and featured innovative architectural elements including suspended gardens, elaborate water features, and decorative programs that combined traditional Mesopotamian motifs with artistic influences from throughout the empire's multicultural territories. And towering above it all, literally, was the Ziggurat Etemenanki. The ziggurat, the step temple tower that served as the architectural focal point of Marduk's temple complex, rose to an estimated height of 91 meters through 7 distinct levels, each smaller than the one below, connected by external staircases that enabled ritual processions to reach the temple shrine at the summit. Its construction required approximately 85 million fired bricks, a number so large that it's almost meaningless without context. Consider that each brick had to be individually manufactured, transported to the construction site, and placed by hand. Consider that the foundation platform extended 15 meters below ground level and incorporated alternating layers of reed matting and bitumen that provided flexible support while distributing structural loads. Consider that each level was decorated with glazed brick facings in different colors, creating a rainbow effect visible from great distances across the plain. This was the Tower of Babel. Or at least, this was the building that inspired the biblical story. And standing at its base, looking up at 91 meters of human ambition reaching toward the sky, you can understand why ancient visitors believed that the builders were trying to reach heaven itself. The urban planning that organized all of these monumental structures into a coherent city demonstrated sophisticated understanding of traffic flow, residential zoning, and commercial organization. The street system incorporated major arterial roads connecting important districts with smaller residential streets that provided neighborhood access while maintaining privacy. Residential districts featured well-planned neighborhoods with standardized house designs incorporating courtyards, multiple rooms, and sanitary facilities. Commercial districts included specialized market areas, craft workshops, and warehouse facilities strategically located near transportation networks. And underlying everything, literally, was the canal system that supplied water to the city and surrounding agricultural areas. This system included major canals connecting Babylon to the Euphrates, distribution networks supplying different urban districts, and drainage channels preventing flooding during seasonal high water periods. The engineering principles employed demonstrated advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering that enabled precise control of water flow rates and distribution patterns while supporting an urban population exceeding 200,000 inhabitants. Babylon, at its height under Nebuchadnezzar, was not just the largest city in the world. It was the most technologically advanced, the most architecturally magnificent, and the most economically productive urban center that human civilization had yet produced. and the man who built it ruled it for 43 years, long enough to see his vision realized, long enough to watch his city become the wonder of the ancient world. But empires built by great men are vulnerable to the mediocrity of their successors, and what came after Nebuchadnezzar would prove that even the mightiest walls cannot protect a civilization from the enemies within. The legal traditions that developed during the exile showed particular Babylonian influence. The casuistic approach characteristic of Babylonian law, analyzing specific cases to establish general principles, became a fundamental feature of rabbinic legal methodology. Jewish scholars adopted Mesopotamian techniques for systematic legal reasoning, while applying them to distinctly Jewish religious and ethical concerns. This synthesis of Babylonian legal method and Hebrew religious content created the foundations of the Talmudic tradition that would become the backbone of Jewish legal and intellectual life for millennia to come. The Aramaic language, which had become the lingua franca of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, also left its mark on Jewish culture. Parts of the biblical books of Daniel and Ezra were composed in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, reflecting the language's importance in Jewish intellectual and religious life during the exile. Aramaic would eventually replace Hebrew as the everyday language of Jewish communities throughout the Near East, and it remained the primary language of Jewish scholarship well into the medieval period. The economic integration of Jewish deportees into Babylonian society proceeded more successfully than anyone might have predicted. The Murashu archive, discovered at Nippur and dating to the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC, provides detailed documentation of how deportee communities evolved economically over time. These cuneiform tablets reveal that many Jewish families had acquired substantial landholdings and engaged in complex business relationships with Babylonian partners. Some deportees achieved positions of considerable influence within the imperial administration. Others established successful commercial enterprises that contributed significantly to regional economic development. This economic success created its own theological challenges. If life in exile was comfortable, even prosperous, what motivation remained for returning to a ruined homeland? The tension between material success in Babylon and spiritual longing for Jerusalem would become one of the defining themes of Jewish literature and identity, a tension that has never been fully resolved and that continues to shape Jewish self-understanding to this day. The Babylonian exile, in short, didn't destroy Judaism. It transformed it. It forced Hebrew thinkers to develop new institutions, new theologies, and new ways of maintaining cultural identity in a foreign environment. And the innovations they created, the synagogue, the emphasis on scripture and education, the portable religious infrastructure that could function anywhere in the world, would prove to be Judaism's greatest survival tools during the centuries of dispersion that lay ahead. None of this was Nebuchadnezzar's intention, of course. He deported the Hebrews to eliminate a security threat and acquire skilled labor for his construction projects. He couldn't have known, couldn't have imagined, that the people he displaced would develop a religious tradition that would eventually give birth to Christianity and Islam, the two largest religions in human history. He couldn't have known that the exile he imposed would become one of the foundational narratives of Western civilization, retold and reinterpreted for over 2,500 years. But that's the thing about history. The consequences of our actions extend far beyond our intentions, and sometimes the most important things that happen are the things nobody planned. We need to go back to Jerusalem, because the story we left hanging in part 2, the story of Zedekiah, the puppet king, and the fragile peace between Babylon and Judah, is about to reach its catastrophic conclusion. And the consequences of what happened next would reshape not just the ancient Near East, but the entire trajectory of Western religious civilization. For about a decade after the first deportation in 597 BC, the arrangement worked. Zedekiah sat on his throne in Jerusalem, paid his tribute to Babylon, and maintained the fiction of Hebrew sovereignty under Babylonian oversight. The deportees, those 10,000 members of the Hebrew elite, settled into their new lives along the Shebar Canal near Nippur, about 60 kilometers southeast of Babylon. They received land allocations, established communities, and began the long, painful process of adapting to life in exile. But the peace was an illusion, and the forces that would shatter it were already in motion. In Jerusalem, the same factional divisions that had led to Jehoiakim's disastrous rebellion continued to simmer. The nationalist faction, those who believed that God would ultimately deliver his chosen people from foreign domination, had not been eliminated by the first deportation. If anything, the humiliation of 597 BC had intensified their determination. Egyptian diplomats continued to circulate through the Levant, offering promises of military support to anyone willing to challenge Babylonian authority. And Zedekiah, despite owing his throne entirely to Nebuchadnezzar's favor, proved unable or unwilling to resist the pressure from his own court. Around 589 BC, Zedekiah made the decision that would destroy his kingdom. He stopped paying tribute to Babylon and entered into a formal alliance with Pharaoh Hophra of Egypt, coordinating a broader Levantine rebellion that included several other vassal states who had been persuaded that Egyptian military power could counterbalance Babylonian dominance. It was, by any rational calculation, insane. The first rebellion had failed catastrophically, and the military balance had only shifted further in Babylon's favor since then. Egypt's promises of support were worth exactly what they had been worth the last time: nothing. And Nebuchadnezzar, who had shown remarkable restraint in 597 BC, was unlikely to be so merciful a second time. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and overwhelming. Babylonian forces swept through the Levant, systematically reducing rebel strongholds, while cutting off any possibility of Egyptian relief. The Egyptian army that Hophra sent northward to support the rebellion was intercepted and defeated before it could reach Jerusalem, confirming what the pragmatists had been saying all along: Egypt could not and would not save Judah from Babylonian wrath. The siege of Jerusalem began in 588 BC and lasted approximately 18 months, a brutal, grinding affair that reduced the city's population to starvation and despair. The Babylonian siege works were comprehensive: earthen ramps, protective barriers, siege engines positioned to batter the walls, and a complete blockade that prevented any supplies from reaching the defenders. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread through the overcrowded population. The prophet Jeremiah, who had warned against rebellion from the beginning, was imprisoned by authorities who viewed his calls for surrender as treason. The end came in the summer of 586 BC. Babylonian forces breached Jerusalem's walls, and what followed was the kind of systematic destruction that leaves scars on a civilization's collective memory for millennia. The city was thoroughly sacked. The Temple of Solomon, the sacred heart of Hebrew religious life, the dwelling place of God on earth according to Hebrew theology, the building that had stood for nearly 400 years as the physical symbol of the covenant between Yahweh and his chosen people, was stripped of its treasures and burned to the ground. Zedekiah attempted to flee, but was captured near Jericho. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, who forced him to watch the execution of his sons before having his eyes put out, ensuring that the last thing the rebel king ever saw was the death of his dynasty. Zedekiah was then taken to Babylon in chains, where he presumably spent the remainder of his life in captivity. The deportation that followed the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC was far more extensive than the targeted extraction of 597 BC. This time, Nebuchadnezzar's administrators were not trying to preserve a functioning vassal state. They were dismantling one. Large portions of the remaining Hebrew population were deported to Babylonia, leaving behind only the poorest farmers, people who lacked the skills, resources, or social connections to pose any threat to Babylonian authority. Jerusalem itself was left in ruins, its walls broken, its temple destroyed, its population scattered. This was the Babylonian exile, one of the most consequential events in the history of Western civilization. And to understand why it matters so much, we need to understand what happened to the Hebrew deportees after they arrived in Babylonia. Because what they experienced there, what they created there, and what they became there would fundamentally transform Judaism, and through Judaism, Christianity and Islam, the three religions that would shape the course of human history for the next 2.5 millennia. The deportees were settled in designated areas throughout Babylonia, with the largest community establishing itself along the Chebar Canal near Nippur. These weren't concentration camps or slave labor colonies. The Neo-Babylonian approach to managing deportee populations was far more sophisticated than that. The deportees received land allocations in areas with access to fertile agricultural land and reliable water sources. They were allowed to maintain their own internal governance systems for managing local disputes and religious affairs. They could own property, engage in business, and participate in the broader Babylonian economy. But they couldn't go home, and they couldn't rebuild their temple. And for a people whose entire religious identity was bound up with a specific piece of land and a specific building, this created a theological crisis of the first order. How do you worship a god whose temple has been destroyed? How do you maintain a covenant with a deity who has apparently allowed his chosen people to be conquered and exiled? How do you preserve a religious identity that is inextricably linked to a homeland you can no longer access? The answers that Hebrew thinkers developed to these questions during the Babylonian exile represent one of the most creative and consequential episodes of theological innovation in human history, and they were profoundly influenced by the Babylonian civilization that surrounded them. The most important institutional innovation was the synagogue. Before the exile, Hebrew worship had been centered on the temple in Jerusalem, a single centralized location where sacrifices were offered and where God's presence was believed to dwell. With the temple destroyed, Hebrew religious leaders had to develop alternative forms of worship that could function without a central sanctuary. The synagogue, a local assembly for prayer, scripture reading, and religious education, emerged as the solution. This was revolutionary. It meant that Jewish worship could happen anywhere, in any city, in any country, in any community large enough to gather a minyan. The synagogue system freed Judaism from its dependence on a single geographic location and created a portable religious infrastructure that would prove crucial for Jewish survival during subsequent centuries of dispersion and persecution. The theological developments were equally profound. Hebrew thinkers grappling with the catastrophe of exile developed new understandings of God's nature and purposes that moved Judaism in directions that would have been unimaginable before 586 BC. The idea that God could use foreign rulers as instruments of divine purpose, that Nebuchadnezzar himself might be serving God's plan by punishing Hebrew unfaithfulness, represented a dramatic expansion of theological thinking that transformed Yahweh from a national deity tied to a specific land into a universal God whose sovereignty extended over all nations and all history. The exposure to Babylonian intellectual culture enriched Hebrew thinking in ways that are still visible in the biblical text. Babylonian creation myths, particularly the Enuma Elish, provided narrative frameworks that influenced the development of Genesis. Babylonian flood narratives contributed to the story of Noah. Babylonian wisdom literature influenced the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Babylonian astronomical knowledge introduced Hebrew scholars to mathematical concepts and calendrical systems that would later influence rabbinic literature and religious practice. But the influence wasn't one-directional. The Hebrew deportees didn't simply absorb Babylonian culture, they engaged with it critically, adapting what was useful while maintaining their distinctive, monotheistic perspective. The result was a creative synthesis that produced some of the most important religious literature in human history. Significant portions of the Hebrew Bible were composed, edited, or compiled during the exile period, including historical works, prophetic literature, and wisdom texts that reflected both traditional Hebrew perspectives and the intellectual stimulation provided by exposure to Mesopotamian civilization. Now let's pull back from Jerusalem and look at the broader picture of how the Neo-Babylonian Empire actually functioned as a multicultural civilization. Because this is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the entire story, and it tells us something important about what made this empire different from what came before and what came after. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably diverse. Within its borders lived Babylonians, Assyrians, Arameans, Chaldeans, Phoenicians, Hebrews, Arabs, Egyptians, and dozens of other ethnic and linguistic groups, each with their own cultural traditions, religious practices, and social structures. Managing this diversity, preventing it from tearing the empire apart while harnessing it as a source of strength, was one of the central challenges of Neo-Babylonian governance, and the solutions they developed were, in many ways, more sophisticated than those of any previous empire. The linguistic dimension of this diversity was addressed through the adoption of Aramaic as the empire's lingua franca, a decision that was both pragmatic and revolutionary. Aramaic was already widely spoken throughout the Levant and parts of Mesopotamia, having spread through centuries of Aramean merchant activity. Rather than trying to impose Akkadian, the traditional language of Mesopotamian high culture, on diverse populations who didn't speak it, Neo-Babylonian administrators simply adopted the language that most people already used for intergroup communication. This was a remarkably sensible approach, and it tells us something important about Neo-Babylonian administrative philosophy. These were pragmatists, not ideologues. They didn't care whether their subjects spoke Akkadian or Aramaic or Hebrew or Phoenician in their homes and temples. They cared whether taxes were collected, whether trade flowed, whether the peace was kept, and if adopting a foreign language as the medium of imperial communication made all of those things easier, then that's what they would do. The adoption of Aramaic alphabetic script alongside traditional cuneiform represented a significant technological advancement that improved administrative efficiency throughout the empire. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system that had been used in Mesopotamia for over 2,000 years, was extraordinarily complex, requiring years of specialized training to master. The Aramaic alphabet, by contrast, used fewer than 24 symbols and could be learned relatively quickly. This meant that the empire could train larger numbers of scribes and administrators in less time, enabling more detailed record-keeping and more frequent communication between administrative levels. The result was a bilingual administrative system that used Aramaic for inter-regional communication and Akkadian cuneiform for internal Babylonian governmental functions. This dual-track approach enabled imperial administrators to communicate effectively with diverse populations while maintaining traditional Mesopotamian administrative practices within core territorial regions. It was elegant, efficient, and remarkably forward-thinking. The archaeological evidence for multicultural integration in Babylon is nothing short of extraordinary. Cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Babylon reveal business contracts written in multiple languages, sealed by merchants from dozens of different ethnic backgrounds. A single commercial district might contain the workshop of an Egyptian glassmaker, the warehouse of a Phoenician textile trader, and the counting house of a Jewish banker. all operating under the same legal framework, all protected by the same royal courts. But Nebuchadnezzar's genius wasn't merely in tolerating diversity, it was in weaponizing it. Every culture that entered Babylon brought with it unique knowledge. Egyptian physicians brought advanced medical techniques. Phoenician sailors brought navigational expertise. Lydian metalworkers brought revolutionary coinage technology. And Jewish scribes brought a literary tradition that would prove more durable than any empire. Nebuchadnezzar created a system where these skills were cataloged, preserved, and deployed for the benefit of the state. The famous Wadi Brisa inscription, carved into the rocks of modern-day Lebanon, provides a window into how Nebuchadnezzar viewed his own multicultural empire. In it, he boasts not just of military conquests, but of the prosperity he brought to all peoples under his rule. He describes himself as a shepherd of nations, a builder of cities, a provider of abundance. This wasn't empty propaganda. The archaeological record confirms that living standards in Babylon during this period were among the highest in the ancient world. The administrative tablets from the southern palace reveal a bureaucracy of staggering sophistication. Ration lists show that deportees from conquered territories received regular food allotments: barley, oil, dates, and beer, distributed according to family size and social status. Some of these lists specifically mention Joachim, king of the land of Yahud, none other than Jehoiakim, the deposed king of Judah, receiving royal rations in Babylonian exile. Even conquered kings were fed from the imperial table. The legal system was equally inclusive. The Code of Hammurabi, though centuries old by this point, still formed the backbone of Babylonian law, and its principles were applied regardless of ethnic origin. Foreign residents could own property, enter into contracts, marry local citizens, and even bring cases before royal judges. The only requirement was loyalty to the crown and payment of taxes. Beyond that, Babylon asked remarkably little of its diverse population. Religious tolerance was perhaps the most striking feature of this multicultural empire. While Marduk reigned supreme as the national deity, the Neo-Babylonian state made no systematic effort to suppress foreign religions. Jewish communities maintained their synagogues, Egyptian residents continued their funerary practices, and Aramaean tribes worshipped their ancestral gods without interference. This tolerance wasn't born of modern liberal values. It was cold, calculated pragmatism. Religious persecution created rebels. Religious tolerance created taxpayers. The result was a city that functioned as the ancient world's greatest melting pot. Walking through the streets of Babylon in the 6th century BCE, you would have heard a dozen languages, smelled the cooking of 100 different cuisines, and witnessed religious rituals from across the known world. It was, in every meaningful sense, the first truly cosmopolitan city in human history. And this cosmopolitanism had profound intellectual consequences. The mixing of cultures produced a flowering of knowledge that would echo through millennia. Babylonian astronomers, drawing on centuries of Mesopotamian observation, and enriched by Egyptian and Greek mathematical techniques, achieved breakthroughs that still astonish modern scientists. They calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the actual value. They predicted lunar eclipses with uncanny accuracy. They developed mathematical models of planetary motion that wouldn't be surpassed until the European Renaissance, more than 2,000 years later. If you're finding this journey through Babylon's multicultural golden age as fascinating as I find it to tell, take a moment to share this with someone who loves history. Every share helps bring these forgotten stories to a wider audience. Now we arrive at what might be the most underappreciated chapter of the Neo-Babylonian story. And honestly, if you remember nothing else from this entire narrative, remember this: Almost everything you take for granted about how we measure time, space, and the heavens above traces back to the minds that worked in the temples and observatories of 6th century Babylon. Let that sink in for a moment. Every time you glance at a clock and see 60 minutes in an hour, every time you measure an angle in degrees, every time you look up at the night sky and recognize the constellations by their ancient names, you are living inside a system invented by Babylonian scholars during the Neo-Babylonian period. This isn't poetic exaggeration. This is documented, verified archaeological fact. The Babylonian base 60 number system, what mathematicians call sexagesimal, is one of the most consequential intellectual innovations in human history. We still use it today, largely unchanged, more than 2,500 years after its refinement. Why 60? Because 60 is the smallest number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making it extraordinarily flexible for calculations involving fractions. The Babylonian mathematicians understood this intuitively, and they built an entire numerical architecture around it that proved so elegant, so practical, that no subsequent civilization ever found reason to replace it. But the true glory of Neo-Babylonian science lay in astronomy. The priests of the Assyrian temple complex didn't just observe the stars, they systematized observation itself. They created the world's first astronomical diaries, continuous dated records of celestial events maintained night after night, year after year, decade after decade. These diaries, inscribed on clay tablets and stored in temple archives, represent the longest continuous scientific dataset in human history. Some sequences span more than 7 centuries of unbroken observation. The implications of this achievement cannot be overstated. With centuries of accumulated data at their fingertips, Neo-Babylonian astronomers began to detect patterns that shorter observation periods could never reveal. They discovered the Saros cycle, an approximately 18-year period, after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat in nearly identical patterns. This discovery allowed them to predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy, a capability that seemed like magic to contemporary civilizations, and that wouldn't be independently rediscovered until the modern era. The astronomical tablets from this period reveal calculations of breathtaking precision. Babylonian astronomers determined the length of the synodic month, the time between successive new moons, as 29.530594 days. The modern value, calculated with atomic clocks and satellite observations, is 29.530589 days. The difference? Less than half a second per month, achieved with nothing more than patient observation, mathematical genius, and clay tablets. They mapped the zodiac, dividing the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun across the sky, into 12 equal segments of 30 degrees each. These 12 divisions became the 12 signs of the zodiac that astrologers still use today. Whether you believe in astrology or dismiss it entirely, the underlying astronomical framework is pure Babylonian science. The planet Venus received particular attention. Babylonian astronomers tracked its appearances and disappearances with obsessive precision, creating tables that predicted its visibility years in advance. They understood that the morning star and the evening star were the same celestial body, a realization that Greek astronomers would later claim as their own discovery, conveniently forgetting their Babylonian predecessors. Jupiter, too, was tracked with extraordinary care. Recent analysis of Babylonian astronomical tablets has revealed something that shocked the academic world. Neo-Babylonian astronomers were using geometric methods to calculate Jupiter's position, essentially plotting the planet's velocity against time and computing the area under the curve. This is a technique that historians of science previously believed was invented in 14th century Europe. The Babylonians were doing it more than 1,500 years earlier. Let me repeat that, because it deserves emphasis. Babylonian astronomers independently developed a form of integral calculus to track planetary motion, nearly 2 millennia before European mathematicians claimed the same breakthrough. The mathematical tablets from this period are equally impressive. Babylonian mathematicians worked with quadratic equations, understood the Pythagorean theorem centuries before Pythagoras was born, calculated square roots and cube roots with remarkable accuracy, and developed sophisticated algorithms for solving complex problems in land surveying, construction, and commerce. The famous YBC 7089 tablet, now housed at Yale University, shows a square with its diagonal, accompanied by an approximation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places, 1.414213. This level of precision wasn't achieved in Europe until the 16th century. And this tablet predates the Neo-Babylonian period. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian mathematics had advanced even further. Medicine, too, benefited from the Neo-Babylonian intellectual renaissance. While Babylonian medicine never fully separated itself from magical and religious practices, the diagnostic texts from this period show a surprisingly empirical approach. Physicians cataloged symptoms, tracked the progression of diseases, and developed treatment protocols based on observed outcomes. The Diagnostic Handbook, compiled and refined during the Neo-Babylonian period, contains descriptions of conditions that modern physicians can identify as epilepsy, stroke, tuberculosis, and various forms of mental illness. Pharmacology was equally advanced. Babylonian healers maintained extensive lists of medicinal plants, minerals, and animal products, along with detailed instructions for preparing remedies. Some of these preparations, particularly those involving willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, were genuinely effective. Others were pure superstition. But the systematic approach to cataloging and testing remedies represents an important step toward evidence-based medicine. The Neo-Babylonian contribution to cartography deserves mention as well. The famous Babylonian map of the world, a clay tablet dating to approximately the 6th century BCE, represents the earliest known attempt to depict the entire known world on a single map. It shows Babylon at the center, naturally, surrounded by a circular ocean, with triangular regions beyond representing distant, semi-mythical lands. While geographically inaccurate by modern standards, it represents a conceptual breakthrough, the idea that the world could be comprehended, measured, and represented in a systematic way. All of this intellectual achievement was supported by an educational infrastructure that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The Aduba, literally tablet house, served as schools where young scribes learned reading, writing, mathematics, and astronomy. The curriculum was rigorous, spanning years of study, and the surviving student exercises show a pedagogical approach that modern educators would recognize. Start with simple copying, progress to increasingly complex problems, and culminate in original composition and analysis. The libraries of Babylon were legendary even in antiquity. While the Library of Alexandria gets most of the historical attention, Babylon's temple libraries predated it by centuries and may have been equally extensive. Thousands of tablets covering every subject from astronomy to zoology were carefully cataloged and stored in climate-controlled rooms within the temple complexes. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, Greek scholars were astonished by the depth and breadth of knowledge preserved in these collections. This scientific legacy represents perhaps the Neo-Babylonian Empire's most enduring contribution to human civilization. Empires rise and fall, cities crumble to dust, but knowledge, once created and transmitted, can survive indefinitely. Every time a modern astronomer calculates an orbital period, every time an engineer measures an angle, every time a doctor diagnoses a patient based on observed symptoms, They are standing on foundations laid by scholars working in the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's great ziggurat. Everything we've discussed so far, the military conquests, the architectural wonders, the scientific achievements, the multicultural administration, all of it rested on the shoulders of one extraordinary man. And in 562 BCE, that man died. Nebuchadnezzar II passed away after 43 years on the throne, the longest reign of any Neo-Babylonian king, and one of the longest in all of Mesopotamian history. He left behind an empire that stretched from the borders of Egypt to the mountains of Anatolia, a capital city that was the wonder of the ancient world, and a legacy that would echo through millennia. But he also left behind a problem that has destroyed more empires than any foreign invasion: no clear succession plan. What followed Nebuchadnezzar's death was a cascade of political violence that would have been darkly familiar to students of Roman or Ottoman history. In the span of just 6 years, Babylon would burn through 4 kings, 3 of whom would be removed by assassination or coup. The empire that had taken decades to build began to unravel with terrifying speed. The first to inherit the throne was Marduk, known in the Bible as Evil Merodach, Nebuchadnezzar's son. Ancient sources paint a contradictory picture of this king. The Book of Kings describes him favorably, noting that he released the captive King Jehoiakim of Judah from prison and treated him with honor. But Babylonian sources suggest a ruler who quickly alienated the powerful priestly class. Whether through incompetence, reformist ambition, or simple bad luck, Marduk lasted barely 2 years before being overthrown. His replacement was Neriglissar, Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law and a military commander of considerable reputation. Neriglissar had participated in the siege of Jerusalem and had decades of experience in imperial administration. For a brief moment, it seemed like the empire might stabilize. Neriglissar launched a successful military campaign into Cilicia, modern southern Turkey, demonstrating that Babylonian military power remained formidable. But fate intervened. Neriglissar died after just 4 years on the throne, possibly of natural causes, leaving his young son Labashi-Marduk as heir. Labashi-Marduk's reign was measured not in years but in months, perhaps as few as 2 or 3. A child king in a court full of ambitious generals and scheming priests was a recipe for disaster, and disaster came swiftly. A conspiracy of courtiers overthrew and killed the boy king, replacing him with one of their own, a nobleman named Nabonidus. And with Nabonidus, the Neo-Babylonian Empire entered its strangest, most controversial, and ultimately final chapter. Nabonidus was, by any measure, one of the most unusual rulers in ancient history. He wasn't from the royal family. His claim to the throne rested entirely on the conspiracy that placed him there. His mother, Adad-Gupi, was a priestess of the moon god Sin at the temple in Haran, and this maternal connection to the lunar cult would define, and ultimately doom, his reign. From the very beginning, Nabonidus made decisions that baffled and infuriated the Babylonian establishment. His most provocative act was his apparent elevation of the moon god Sin above Marduk, the supreme deity of Babylon. For a civilization that had spent centuries building its identity around Marduk worship, this was more than a theological disagreement. It was an existential threat. The priests of the Asagila, the most powerful religious institution in the empire, viewed Nabonidus's religious reforms as nothing less than blasphemy. But Nabonidus went even further. In approximately 553 BCE, he made the extraordinary decision to leave Babylon entirely, relocating to the distant Arabian oasis of Tama in modern Saudi Arabia, where he would remain for approximately 10 years. 10 years. The king of the world's greatest empire simply left. The reasons for this self-imposed exile remain one of ancient history's most debated mysteries. Some scholars believe Nabonidus was pursuing commercial interests. Tama sat at the crossroads of lucrative Arabian trade routes. Others suggest he was conducting archaeological excavations, as Nabonidus had a well-documented fascination with ancient ruins and inscriptions, earning him the nickname the First Archaeologist. Still others propose that he was establishing a new religious center for sin worship, free from the interference of Marduk's priests. A few have even suggested mental illness, though this interpretation relies heavily on hostile sources. Whatever his reasons, the consequences were devastating. During Nabonidus's absence, the crucial New Year festival, the Akitu, could not be properly celebrated, because the ritual required the king's physical presence in Babylon. Year after year, the festival was cancelled or abbreviated, and year after year, the priesthood's resentment grew. In a society where religious ritual was inseparable from political legitimacy, the cancellation of the Akitu was equivalent to a constitutional crisis. Nabonidus left his son Belshazzar, yes, the Belshazzar of the biblical book of Daniel, as regent in Babylon. Belshazzar was competent enough as an administrator, but he lacked the authority of a crowned king. He couldn't perform the sacred rituals, couldn't make binding treaties, and couldn't command the full loyalty of the military. He was, in effect, a placeholder, and everyone knew it. The internal divisions created by Nabonidus's absence and religious policies created exactly the kind of vulnerability that a predator empire would exploit, and by the 54 OHS BCE, such a predator had emerged from the mountains of Persia, a conqueror whose speed, ambition, and political genius would make even Nebuchadnezzar look cautious by comparison. His name was Cyrus, and he was coming for Babylon. To understand how the greatest city in the world fell almost without a fight, we need to step outside Babylon's walls and look east, to the highlands of Persia, where a revolution was underway that would reshape the entire ancient world. Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great, began his career as the king of Anshan, a relatively minor Persian kingdom subject to the Median Empire. The Medes, you'll recall, had been Babylon's allies in the destruction of Assyria. For decades, the Medes and Babylonians had maintained a rough balance of power, with the Zagros Mountains serving as a natural boundary between their spheres of influence. In 550 BCE, Cyrus shattered that balance. He revolted against his Median overlord, Astyages, and in a campaign of stunning speed, conquered the entire Median Empire. Overnight, the minor king of Anshan became the ruler of a vast territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Anatolia. The Babylonian response to this upheaval was complicated. Nabonidus, still in Tama, initially seems to have welcomed the fall of Media, perhaps viewing Cyrus as a useful counterweight to Median power. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Cyrus wasn't interested in balance. He was interested in everything. In 547 BCE, Cyrus turned west and conquered the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, capturing its legendary king Croesus, the man whose name became synonymous with wealth, rich as Croesus. With Lydia's gold mines and Greek coastal cities now under his control, Cyrus commanded resources that dwarfed anything Babylon could muster. Over the next several years, Cyrus systematically absorbed the remaining independent kingdoms of the Iranian Plateau and Central Asia, building an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Each conquest added soldiers, wealth, and prestige to the Persian war machine. Each conquest brought Cyrus one step closer to the ultimate prize, Babylon itself. Cyrus's approach to empire building was radically different from anything the ancient world had seen before. Where Assyria had ruled through terror and Babylon through cultural assimilation, Cyrus ruled through what we might call strategic tolerance. He allowed conquered peoples to keep their religions, their customs, and often their local rulers, asking only for loyalty and tribute in return. This policy was devastatingly effective because it turned potential rebels into willing subjects. And Cyrus understood something that Nabonidus apparently didn't. Legitimacy matters more than force. While Nabonidus alienated his own priesthood, Cyrus cultivated relationships with disaffected groups throughout the Babylonian Empire. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror but as a liberator, a righteous king chosen by the gods to restore proper order. His propaganda was sophisticated, targeted, and extraordinarily effective. The famous verse account of Nabonidus, a text almost certainly commissioned by Cyrus's agents, paints a devastating portrait of the Babylonian king as a madman and a heretic. It accuses Nabonidus of neglecting Marduk, canceling the sacred festivals, oppressing the people, and generally being unfit to rule. Whether any of these accusations were true is almost beside the point. What matters is that they were widely believed, even within Babylon itself. By 540 BCE, the strategic situation was dire. Cyrus controlled an empire that surrounded Babylon on three sides. His army was larger, better equipped, and battle-hardened from a decade of continuous conquest. His intelligence network had penetrated the Babylonian court, and his propaganda had turned significant portions of the Babylonian population, particularly the priesthood, into potential collaborators. Nabonidus, finally recognizing the danger, returned to Babylon from his decade-long sojourn in Tema. But it was too late. The damage to his legitimacy was irreparable. The military situation was desperate, and the internal divisions he had created made unified resistance nearly impossible. In the autumn of 539 BCE, Cyrus launched his invasion. The campaign was shockingly brief. The decisive battle took place at Opias, on the Tigris River, where the Babylonian army was routed. Persian forces then advanced on Sippar, which surrendered without a fight. And then, on October 12, 539 BCE, a date preserved in both Babylonian chronicles and Persian records, the army of Cyrus the Great entered the city of Babylon. What happened next has been the subject of debate for 2.5 millennia. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document that is sometimes called the First Declaration of Human Rights, claims that Babylon welcomed the Persians as liberators, that the city gates were opened without resistance, and that Cyrus entered in peace. The Babylonian Chronicle largely confirms this account, stating that Cyrus's general Gobryas entered Babylon without battle, but other sources hint at a darker reality. The Greek historian Herodotus tells a dramatic story of the Persians diverting the Euphrates River and entering the city through the dry riverbed, while the Babylonians were celebrating a festival, unaware that their city had already fallen. The Book of Daniel places the fall of Babylon during Belshazzar's famous feast, where a mysterious hand writes Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin on the palace wall. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. The truth probably lies somewhere between these accounts. It's likely that significant elements within Babylon, particularly the Marduk priesthood, actively collaborated with the Persians, opening gates and facilitating the conquest. It's also likely that there was some resistance, particularly from military units loyal to Nabonidus and Belshazzar. But the overall picture is clear. The greatest city in the world fell with remarkably little bloodshed, brought down less by Persian military might than by its own internal divisions. Nabonidus was captured and, according to most sources, treated with surprising clemency, exiled rather than executed. Belshazzar's fate is less certain. Some sources suggest he was killed during the conquest, while others indicate he survived. The Neo-Babylonian dynasty, which had begun with Nabopolassar's daring rebellion against Assyria just 67 years earlier, was finished.